Hello, Nathaniel Gavronsky here, and I am in Raleigh, North Carolina, in Union Square, which is the state capitol grounds for North Carolina. I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of the capital of North Carolina. So during the colonial period, there really wasn't a fixed seat of government for North Carolina. There was some, beginnings, when it was all this one Carolina. The states, the colony kind of had a hard time figuring out where the capital city was going to be, and that really wasn't settled even after they were split until after the Revolutionary War. Now, in 1796, they choose this plot of land, but it wasn't just by chance. See, a colonel by the name of Joel Lane had a bunch of land up here, and nearby this land was a tavern that was run by Sir Isaac Hunter. Now, this tavern must have had some amazing drinks. One specifically was called a cherry bounce, because that's exactly what the legislature did. They bounced right in and bought the land by Mr. Lane, and the colonel was very happy to part ways with it. In fact, the cherry bounce was such a wonderful drink that they mandated that the Capitol building be built a short distance from Sir Isaac Hunter's tavern. I have looked for the official recipe of this cherry bounce. There's a couple of them on the internet, but I can't prove which one was actually the original one. And from my time down here in Raleigh and in North Carolina, I found that most people believe this is a myth, that there were some other things going on, but the tavern did exist. The tavern did have good drinks on hand, and that's why this plot of land was used for the Capitol building. Now, the Capitol building here that was originally built looked a lot more like Independence Hall. They added a couple stories. They finished it in 1799. They did some work in 1822 and 1828, and they were actually renovating it again in 1831. And sadly, in June of 1831, why they were fireproofing the building, it caught fire because someone who was roofing the building wasn't paying attention, and the building caught fire, burning to the ground in a couple of hours. Devastating enough, there were people who did run to the building and try to save some artifacts, and those artifacts are actually in the state capitol building. If you want to come in and check them out, there's a key and a few other bricks and plates. However, one artifact that was lost was not fixable. It was a complete loss, and that was a statue of George Washington. That was a very controversial statue of George Washington. It was made by Antonio Canova from Italy. And the interesting thing about this statue, he never met Washington, never saw anything about Washington, but this was during that time period where that Washington was being seen more in Roman dress, togas. Portraits were more like, on porticos of overlooking Roman cities. And his statue resembled that. And it was very controversial because his legs are bare, his toes are showing. He doesn't have the traditional wig look. His hair looks a little bit different. And he's writing with an interesting looking pen the first couple of lines of his farewell address in Latin. Now, this statue was damaged beyond repair in the 1831 fire, and when they built this building, which the cornerstone was laid in 1833, completed in 1840, they wanted to replace that statue. However, it wasn't until 1970 did the statue actually put back. It was actually carved by another Italian sculptor, but it is a really close replica. I can't say if it's an absolute exact replica, because how can you actually do that? But the interesting thing about this statue is that it was so controversial that people put it on plates and trinkets, and people were coming to the Capitol, not so much the lobby for redress of grievances, because they wanted to see the statue of the bare-legged George Washington. So that was a really interesting time period for that early part of North Carolina history. But you can still see these plates around. I've actually seen them around in antique shops and in going through my travels through history of being something from North Carolina. Now, this building was completed in 1840, and it became the seat of government from 1840 all the way to 1963. See, in 1940, they discovered that the building was just outdated. They had outgrown it, and they needed to move on. So in 1888, the Supreme Court had moved out. They moved to their own building, and in 1940, they had the allocated funds to build a legislative building, which was the first one to do that. There's several states have done it since, but there's actually a road just down here. And there's a big legislative building. It's huge. It's got several little fountains and courtyards inside the building. The basic rotunda, which really isn't one, has a roof that's has more relations to like the Louvre in Paris than say a dome on a Capitol building like this one. That's where the legislature does meet, the House and the Senate. All the legislative offices are there. The governor has a couple of offices. One is in the governor's mansion. One is in the administrative building, which is going to be torn down here very quickly. And then he does have a building, an office in this building here, which still allows it to be the capital of North Carolina, since the governor's office does remain here. So some of the Civil War history of it. So this was the capital of North Carolina during the Civil War. There was the governor that was elected in 1862 was still in power towards the end of the war. His name was Zebulon Vance, and he wanted to protect the building from the incoming Union forces. So when the Union forces started approaching the Capitol building in Raleigh and seeing what had happened to several other prominent Southern buildings, the governor negotiated a peaceful surrender of Raleigh, and he moved him and the Confederate forces here out of Raleigh, and with an agreement that the Union forces would preserve this building, which they did. They preserved the building. It is entirely intact from the Civil War. It did not have any major damages. But, it's the reason why it is actually a very, very small building. For those of you that, see a lot of capitals, this is about the size of maybe the original part of, a little bit bigger than the original building of Annapolis, and it's a little bit bigger than Independence Hall, the original capital of Pennsylvania. But this is more in line, kind of a little bit bigger than the fourth and first capitals of Illinois and Iowa, respectively. So the fourth capital of Illinois and the first state capital of Iowa is a slightly larger version than that, but it has kind of the same layout. One of the interesting things about the building is that when it was being built, it had three different architects. The last one was a guy named Peyton, and he liked more open and lighter spaces using stone. Typically, stone buildings were all enclosed and dark and dampy. As an example of this, the state capital of New York, for an example, is very kind of dark and feels like a dungeon sometimes. But he took the middle, so that the second floor where the legislatures meet, right below the dome, and he cut that out. And so for Illinois and Iowa, if I want you to think of your rotundas, so Iowa and Illinois are sister buildings. The Illinois Capitol building, the middle floor, the legislative floor, has a hole in it. You can go from the very, very bottom, look straight up to the top to the dome. Used to be able to do that in Iowa, but the floor in Iowa was actually structural. It needed to be there, and so they had to put the floor back in, but it is a glass floor. But you can kind of see that's kind of the differences between what the buildings would have felt like. And so he decided he wanted to make that middle legislative floor have that opening there. And it's a very beautiful look. It's a very simple dome. Obviously, it's actually one of the shortest as far as tall capitals that are kind of Greek in style. This is modeled after a lot of different buildings in Greece. So it's kind of that Roman, Greco-Roman architecture. They kind of was having around for most federal buildings at the time. But the building is still technically the Capitol because the governor's office is here. They do use it for special sessions and special occasions. They do award ceremonies here. It has its moments where it actually shines as the North Carolina Capitol. The legislative building is where they do all this stuff. The Supreme Court and then the Secretary of State's outside of it. So really the only office left in the North Carolina Capitol is the governor's office. But it's still standing here ever since 1840. Construction started in 1833, but since 1833 to now, it's still standing. Very beautiful building. There's a lot of statues around here. There are two actual statues of George Washington outside of the Capitol building. There is a monument for the veterans. And interesting thing about North Carolina is that there are definitely two, possibly a third president born in North Carolina, being the first one is questionable because the border was so questionable, and it was the area where he was born, Andrew Jackson. It was kind of somewhat North Carolina, maybe South Carolina. He, in letters to Calhoun, committed how he was from South Carolina, but he was also trying to get Calhoun to go help him with the what do you call the Notification Act on tariffs. So he kind of needed some support from South Carolina. But when he was captured by the British, he was in North Carolina with his in-laws, the Crawfords. Well, not his in-laws, his aunt and uncle, the Crawfords. They were in North Carolina when he was captured. He spent most of his life in the Carolinas, in North Carolina, before moving out to Tennessee to become the prosecutor, district attorney out in Tennessee. So North Carolina is basically his home. The next one is James K. Polk, who was actually born in Pineville, which is now also surrounded by Charlotte. So Charlotte is now kind of where the Jackson birth space was. And so they are both here. And then Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's second vice president, after Hamlin bowed out in the '64 election, he was actually born here in Raleigh. And ran away from his indentured servitude while he was in being indentured servitude in Raleigh, and wasn't able to return because he would have been arrested for running away from his duties. But Raleigh is really nice. So it's the kind of Research Triangle here. There's Raleigh, there's Durham, and then there's Chapel Hill, and that kind of represents the Research Triangle. It's some of the three great universities, and it's a lot of young people here with a lot of high-paying jobs, really highly educated people that make up the community of Raleigh. But the Capitol grounds here is very, very pretty. There's monuments to the different wars that took place since the Revolutionary War. I recommend coming out. The food here is really, really good. Great hospitality. The legislative building, I believe, is open to the public. During normal business hours. I come here during session and talk to them during session, so I know what, if you have a purpose, do. But I'm pretty sure it's open to the general public. I don't know about the walk with the porches and patios upstairs, outside the chambers, but I know most of the building is open to the public for mostly walking around and taking a look and meeting your staffers of your legislators. So that's Raleigh, North Carolina's North Carolina Capitol building. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please like, subscribe, follow. Please share these videos. I want to make sure as many people get a chance to learn about these capitals and come and visit them as possible, because that gets people engaged in civic government and civics and being a part of the government of the people, for the people, by the people. So that's one of the reasons I do these videos. So thank you very much. Stay healthy, stay wealthy, and as always, stay wise, Raleigh.